All right, thanks for your patience, and I hope you enjoyed the snacks and everything. Now, after covering the demand side in the afternoon, there is a supply side of big data. Crucially, data centers need lots of water, lots of land resources, and lots of energy resources. That's why they're very excited to introduce panelists who come from those perspectives. So moderating, we have Chris Winter here at CU at the Getches-Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment, Marshall Brown, General Manager for Aurora Water, Jack Ihle, RVP of Regulatory Policy at Xcel, Stacy Tellinghuisen, Deputy Director of Policy and Clean Energy at Western Resource Advocates, and Rebecca White, Director of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much. Again, my name is Chris Winter. I'm the Executive Director of the Getches-Wilkinson Center here at Colorado Law School. And GWC is a research institute, much like Silicon Flatirons, that focuses on the sustainable management of natural resources across the American West, including issues relating to water, energy, public lands, and the intersection of those issues with climate change and the rights of tribes and indigenous peoples. So I'd like to start by thanking Matt and Silicon Flatirons for the opportunity to help facilitate this conversation today, because I think that the build out of AI infrastructure and data centers cuts across so many issues that are critical to the future of our communities here in Colorado and across the West. So I'm really happy to be here. We also know that there's a lot of snow falling outside, so thank you for making the effort to join us. Thank you to our speakers for trudging through the snow to join us today. Some of us might groan at the thought of traffic delays and shoveling off our sidewalks when it snows. But of course, many of us here in Colorado also breathe a sigh of relief to see snow falling from the sky. And that's because this has been one of the warmest and driest winters on record here in Colorado. And we rely on snow here in Colorado for clean water, to mitigate fire risk, to support our agricultural and recreation-based economies across the state. And climate change is really threatening the fabric of our way of life here in Colorado. And so this is a good reminder, really, of why we're here and why so many people care about the conversation we're going to have today. Because Colorado, like many places across the West, has invested decades of work and hundreds of millions of dollars into sustainability initiatives. This includes decarbonation of the energy sector. We have binding greenhouse gas reduction targets here in Colorado. We're supposed to be working towards a net zero economy by 2050. We have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into water conservation measures. And the Colorado Water Plan is, of course, being worked on hard across the state. Smart community planning and many other important long-term efforts. And those initiatives enjoy broad public support here in the state because people feel the effects of climate change every day here in Colorado, and we're worried about the future. And so that's why I think people are truly hungry for this conversation, for accurate, meaningful information as to what the development of data centers truly means for our communities, environment, and our economic prosperity here in Colorado. And so I think we are all looking for real-world solutions. I hope we can talk about those today. Data and information, and we know that this demand from data centers for our resources is likely here to stay. So we're thrilled to be able to host this panel because these are the experts, I hope, who can help provide us with a deeper understanding of both the challenges we face and how we can get this right for the people of Colorado and people across the West. So I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists a question, and I'm going to ask you all also to introduce yourselves and provide a little bit more background on how you come to this issue and the position with the organizations that you represent. So I have some opening questions, and then we'll do some further panel conversation, and I hope to leave some time at the end for some questions. I know I could tell from the last panel there's really a burning interest from the audience, from all of you, to ask some questions of our panelists, so I hope we'll have some time for that. And Matt has been kind enough to give me license to run over. So we may bump up against 4:30, so I'll try not to cut into too much time for the reception, but I think this is a really unique opportunity for this conversation. So why don't we kick it off? I'm gonna start with Jack. And Jack, panel one today highlighted the dramatic increase in demand for data center expansion and energy consumption. And so I'm hoping you can share with us some information on how Xcel is approaching the work to meet this need, both in the immediate sense and also sustaining that into the future.
All
right, so I think we start with our introductions and then
Yes, that'd be
use
great.
your question a bit. Okay, Jack Ihle. So actually my title is out of date on LinkedIn, but I've been in the data center role. I'm AVP of data centers and large loads for Xcel Energy, which is across all of our 8 states of service. And I'm just about hitting the 100-day point, the sort of proverbial 100-day of my administration in that area. I previously was Regional Vice President of Regulatory Policy, so working a lot with the Public Utilities Commission, with Rebecca and the commissioners and many stakeholders there, including Stacy as well. My job now is to facilitate our commercial ability to serve data centers, ensure that our company strategy aligns up with that, guide our policies, and that's across all 8 states now. So that means regulatory policies, statutory policies, legislative policies, which are very strong interests across many of the PUCs and public service commissions, as well as the legislatures, and ensure that our communications points, strategic communications, just a pretty broad gamut of things, but related to a more narrow set of this fundamental change in our service. And you asked a super broad question, but yeah, this for us, this is a huge new change in the challenge of providing utility service and energy service, where previously we had seen load growth that was about 0.5% per year. I just saw some EIA data that showed in 2025, so this is nationally, the load growth, or the energy sales, I should say, to be more specific, the megawatt hour sales. I think it was about 2.8% nationally, and that's the highest number I can recall in my 25-year history in the power sector. So we're seeing that. We're seeing it in big chunks come along. These are customers who may be 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, 500 megawatts. They're literally on the scale of power plants. That is fundamentally new. We have a few of those customers historically, but that has been probably every few decades, and now I get requests every few days. Not all of them may come through, but it's fundamentally changing our industry. But we are seeking across all of our 8 states to make this consistent with Xcel Energy's clean energy policies and progress. Here in Colorado, we're about 46% clean energy on an annual megawatt hour, annual energy basis. That's in 2025 data. We have reduced our carbon emissions 60% since 2005 as of 2025 data. And we don't want to stop that. We recognize that this is kind of a new challenge. We were doing that in an era where, as I said, the sales growth wasn't nearly as dynamic as it is now. And so it puts more pressure on some of the generation choices and some of the investment choices. But we're still seeking to do that and advance clean energy in different ways. We're also very strongly seeking to protect customers. We can certainly talk about that, but currently I moved from supervising 1 large load tariff filing to now supervising 5 in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas. Very, very vibrant issue. And what that means is it's the rates that are set for very large customers, inclusive of data centers. It's not all just data centers either. There are other large customers as well. And allocating those costs in a way that's fair, such that there is not an affordability impact to other residential customers especially, but also other types of businesses. And we are stating that our aim is to protect them fully from that, and if not, provide some benefits either monetarily or through other types of investments that this industry may bring. So maybe I'll pause there. I think we're going to dive into a lot of this.
Great. Thanks, Jack. We'll definitely have some follow-up questions for you. Stacy, we're going to turn to you next, and I was hoping that you could talk about your perspectives and WRA's perspectives on the demand side, the supply side, and your thoughts on the immediate and long-term resource impacts in terms of energy and especially water as well.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to be here and to speak. My name is Stacy Tellinghuisen. I'm Deputy Director of Policy Development at Western Resource Advocates. We're a nonprofit conservation organization. We work on healthy rivers, on Western lands, and on advancing clean energy and climate policies. Our work is both at the Public Utilities Commission across the region, and then also we engage in state legislative efforts as well. And I'll comment both on Colorado, but also maybe provide some comments on kind of the broader trends that we're seeing in the West. Last summer, Western Resource Advocates published a report on data centers, and we wanted to see, what is the load growth that's forecast just for the largest utilities in the interior West. And how does this compare to some of the national reports that we've seen? And, we found our analysis was pretty staggering. And we are seeing the largest utilities were forecasting load growth of roughly 30% by 2030 and over 50% by 2035. And that's really true for almost every major utility in the West. So there's no exception to that right now. And I think our broad concern is that level of load growth really threatens meeting our climate goals for the region. And I think what we're seeing is that how these load forecasts actually translate into impacts on climate goals varies by state. So in Colorado, as you mentioned, we have pretty robust climate regulations and statutes. And I think those are, so far, I think helping to contain the impact on forecast emissions in this state. But I think we feel a lot of pressure on those regulations and on that legislation today. In other states, I think the story is more bleak, perhaps. So in Nevada, NV Energy, which is the largest utility that serves that state, forecast tremendous load growth. They forecast roughly 50% increase in load growth, I think, by 2030, and a real backsliding on their emissions goals or emissions trajectory, so that they were projecting to emit, I think, an additional 3 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 relative to their prior forecast. And that was largely because they're dispatching their gas plants at higher levels. And so I think that's one of the biggest concerns we have is, again, how this affects our emissions trajectory. This also translates, of course, into water demands. There's water demands at the site of the data center. There's also water demands at the power plant that's providing the energy, depending on the type of power that is supporting that data center. And then the consumer impacts. And so from a policy perspective, where this takes us is how do we enact policies that safeguard our clean energy and our climate goals, that protect water resources, and that protect customers? And how do we leverage the vast financial resources of these corporations to help advance our goals, particularly on clean energy? Thanks.
Great, thank you, Stacy. And we'll come back to that conversation around policies and solutions in a minute. Marshall, thank you for joining us. And it's so great to have you here. And I was mentioning to you earlier, I heard you speak at the Colorado Water Congress earlier this year, just a couple weeks ago, and found that conversation so compelling in terms of the way the city of Aurora has handled the challenges, and especially some of the water challenges presented by data centers. And so I was hoping you could share with us, tell us a little bit about the story of the city of Aurora, which is home to a number of data centers, including, I think, Colorado's soon-to-be largest data center. And what can you share with us about the real and perceived trade-offs at the local level, and how has the city approached these challenges?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So Aurora, one thing that is commonly talked about with data centers are the resource requirements, right? And they were mentioned early, the land, the power. One thing that doesn't get talked about quite as much, but is also a requirement for data centers, is fiber optics, or communications in and out of the data center is really important also. And then water. So when data centers approach a municipality, for example, like Aurora, to develop within Aurora, they've typically already sorted through at least the energy and the communications, the fiber optics challenges before they approach us. And then they'll talk to a local entity about financial incentives or land availability or land use policies, things like that, zoning. And water tends to be one of the last things that they talk about. But a few years ago, Aurora recognized that there was the potential for a large volumetric need for water associated with data centers. Not just data centers, though, other large water users. So data centers, you probably all are aware, consume water due to the cooling demands. It's an evaporative cooling system. It's not unlike other industrial facilities' cooling systems. So we created criteria a number of years ago. We call it our large water user guide, and we said, here's what we will allow from a water use perspective in Aurora, and it's been fascinating. The results have been a little bit fascinating for Aurora. We've received no pushback from the developers of the data centers, which is a positive. Aurora has 8 data centers. Our largest data center, which is soon to be a 177 megawatt facility, uses the least amount of water because it's the newest and it came in under that criteria, and they have a closed refrigerant-based system, so they consume no water for their cooling. They charge the system initially and it stays in there for a long time. Just to kind of put a comparison out there, a single-family residential home uses about 5,000 gallons a month for their water demand. That facility, now it's not fully operational right now, and I should clarify, 5,000 to 10,000 roughly for a typical single-family residential home in Aurora, depending on if it's winter or summer. That facility, they have other indoor things going on, but that data center, which is probably operating somewhere between 60 and 90 megawatts, is my understanding right now, it's not fully built out, is using 22,000 gallons a month of water. So only about 2 to 4 times what a single family residential home would use. So it's not a local water resource impact. Our smallest data center, which is also one of our oldest, uses about 1.8 million gallons of water a month. They have an evaporative cooling system. So it's dramatic, the difference on a local water resource impact that a data center can have based on the cooling technology that they incorporate. So we chose to create criteria and say, here's what we'll support in Aurora, and the data centers have stepped up and are creating very little local footprint on our water resource, on the demands that they put on our water resources.
Thanks, Marshall. That's fascinating. Rebecca, thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Really looking forward to hearing from you as well. And this issue isn't going away anytime soon. And so I think we're interested to hear more about how Colorado PUC is preparing to continue to have this conversation, balancing different perspectives and concerns related to this issue regarding data center expansion. And so I'm hoping you can share some comments with us on where you see this conversation headed at the state level and how the PUC is thinking about this moving forward.
Yeah, sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So in the spirit of the introduction, my name is Rebecca White again. I serve as the director of the Public Utilities Commission. I've been there about 3 years and have learned in that time that the PUC is not a household name to virtually anyone, maybe this room accepted. But we are the primary regulatory body over our investor-owned utilities in Colorado. And so for purposes of this discussion and our electric grid, that's Xcel Energy, and my friend Jack Ihle at the end there, as well as Black Hills. So those are the 2 main utilities we oversee. I'll share the mission with the PUC with you because I think it's really important to the context of this debate. So our job is to ensure the safety, reliability, and affordability of the utility system consistent with the environmental, social, and economic objectives of our state. That is a heck of a balance, and we are seeing all of that sort of play out right now with data centers. So to answer your question about sort of where we are as a state, I'll just offer a little bit of context because this is a really fascinating moment for utilities and energy policy in Colorado and nationwide. But right now, we're at a place where I would say, and I'm curious if the panel would agree with me, data centers are still nascent in Colorado. From the latest I've seen, there are anywhere from 50 to 60 of them total. That seems like a big number, but when we look at states like Virginia, like Georgia, New York, New Jersey, massive number of data centers. The other thing that makes this a little bit nascent is we don't have the large hyperscalers in Colorado yet. So there's actually an opportunity, because this is nascent, for us to think about this in Colorado and try to get this right because we have time to prepare. Part of what is holding data centers back, I think, from coming to Colorado, which is another interesting context, is we don't offer sales and use tax exemption for data centers. And that has been a big driver for them coming into other states. We don't have that right now in Colorado. The other thing that makes this so interesting at this sort of moment in time is there's a lot of other demands on our energy grid. Now, data centers, by far, they're the biggest, scariest megawatt demand number. But because we're trying to reach greenhouse gas goals in Colorado, we're seeing electric demand grow regardless. So we're trying to get people into EVs. We want to see 1 million EVs on the road by 2030. That's a lot of electricity to power all those cars. We're trying to electrify our homes and businesses. We're electrifying our oil and gas fields. So I think Jack was saying earlier that we've had, for the Colorado PUC for the last decades, very stable, modest growth in electric demand that was very easy to predict. We could all kind of wrap our arms around that and move very deliberately towards our clean energy goals. And now those demands are going like that. And so these questions of how do we stay on target to meet our greenhouse gas goals and how do we keep rates affordable is really important and is part of what the PUC is wrangling with right now. So to your question about what specifically is going on, so at the state legislature, there's 2 bills that have been introduced. They are on polar opposites of this debate right now. One is a bill that's more in favor of, or drafted by a lot of the environmental groups who are very worried about data centers. And it would set a whole bunch of restrictions on data centers when they come into Colorado, including that they have to provide pretty much every megawatt would be a clean energy source. So that's sort of one bill. The other one is much more friendly and welcoming to data centers that would provide that tax exemption. And yes, it would require some progress towards clean energy, but a much different type of bill. And so we're sort of calling this within our halls at work the data center wars, because there are these 2 very different debates. And last year in the legislature, we saw sort of the same dynamics, and a bill ultimately wasn't passed. So that part of the big policy context is what the legislature will decide to do. And a lot of that does drive on whether we're going to offer a tax exemption. But then I'll just speak to what is before the PUC now. And there's a couple pieces. So Jack spoke to the fact that we expect Xcel to come in about a month with a large load tariff, which will essentially be Xcel's proposal to the commission on how much the data centers should pay. So that'll be a very interesting litigated proceeding for our 3 commissioners. Those are the ones who make these policy decisions to sort of determine how we can hold ratepayers harmless, how we can make sure that these data centers are paying their fair share, which means are they fully covering their costs, and how do we guarantee that over the long term, right? Because the resources we need to invest in are here 20, 30 years. You think of a solar field or a wind farm or storage or natural gas, and if a data center is only here for 5 to 10 years, you've left ratepayers paying for that asset after they're gone. So we will be litigating that when it comes in April. But the decision that's behind us now that I can speak to is called the Just Transition Solicitation. And this is part of electric resource planning. So all the utilities in Colorado, they come into the PUC about every 4 years. They look out at about a 5-year window and say, all right, here's what we expect to need for energy demand. In the PUC, we're going to ask you to approve X number of megawatts of resources to meet that demand. These have always been difficult proceedings, but it was a much different context. And Jack can speak to this more than I can because I've only been there about 3 years. But when demand was relatively flat and stable, that was a much different set of decisions than what is before the commission now when we look at these just huge growth in energy demand. So where the commission landed on this just transition solicitation, and it was called that because we're retiring our coal plants in Colorado, and part of the debate over this is making the communities whole that are losing the coal plants like Pueblo and Craig, so that was why it was called this. But the commission ultimately approved about 6,000 additional megawatts, but they really heavily debated any growth beyond that because a lot of that was what you assume about data centers. And the commission ultimately said, We will allow for growth to meet data centers, but we want to see a contract signed. We don't want a promise or an indication that they're coming to enable the utility to go build that resource. We want to see something sort of carved in stone. So we have that kind of decision behind us. We have the tariff coming up, and then the data center wars at the legislature. And I think I talked way too long.
That was perfect. Thank you. No, that was great. I mean, I think we're now getting to the nuts and bolts of actual policy solutions. And so that's exactly the conversation we want to have. So thank you for that. And I want to follow up on the point that you just made, which is the two pending or competing proposals right now in the General Assembly. For all of you out there, if you're following along, Senate Bill 102 is the one that does not rely on incentives, and House Bill 1030 is the incentive-based proposal. And those are both, as we mentioned, pending in the General Assembly in the state capitol. And so I would like to ask our panelists if they have views on those competing proposals, if you can share any details about those with the audience. And I think I might start with Stacy, because I know that she's done an impressive amount of work, and WRA is also heavily invested in one of these bills. And so I'll turn it over to Stacy first.
Thanks. So WRA has been really deeply engaged in helping to develop and shape and kind of negotiate provisions around Senate Bill 102, which is sponsored by Senator Kathy Kipp and Representative Brown. And, we think that it really sets a gold standard and creates a model for other states to pursue that creates a lot of protections. So it creates important consumer protections. It requires data centers to make certain contract commitments or payments that protect consumers against the risk that the data center doesn't show up or shows up at a smaller level than they initially forecast. It contains some requirements around water. So I think one of the big challenges that I think Marshall alluded to is that there's a lot of uncertainty about the water use of data centers. And we frankly don't have a lot of information on that and what the water use looks like for different types of data centers. And so it requires some reporting and transparency and additional information. I think it will likely also set a water use efficiency standard as a baseline threshold for data centers. And then it requires some transparency and provisions for communities that could be impacted. I think the goal is to protect existing communities that are already disproportionately impacted by sources of pollution from, kind of another potential source of pollution. A lot of these data centers come with backup diesel generators because they want to make sure that they have power around the clock, including in an emergency. And so there are provisions, for example, to limit the amount that those diesel generators can be operated during the year. And then finally, the piece that I think we're most engaged on is the clean energy provisions. And, there are provisions in it that require sort of no backsliding against utilities' existing emissions goals. And there are provisions that require a new data center to bring clean energy to meet its load. And I think one factor or one feature of those that's important to recognize is that it doesn't just require a data center to bring a lot of new solar to the table or not a lot of new wind to the table. It requires that data center to bring resources that can actually meet its load, kind of throughout the year and throughout the day. So data centers have a really high they're high load factor customers, so they require energy kind of around the clock, which doesn't match well with intermittent wind or solar. And on a system like Xcel's in particular that has high levels of renewables and is going to be getting to really high levels of renewables, one thing we sort of are concerned about is just seeing more renewables that are brought onto the system that curtail existing renewables, because that imposes costs on customers and doesn't help us advance our clean energy goals in the way we want to see them. So that's kind of an overview of the Senate Bill 102. I think we'll likely see some modifications as we go through the legislative process and some negotiations. I'll just contrast that with Senate Bill 1030, which is kind of the industry-backed bill, which provides tax incentives, and I think it probably has some real hurdles in front of it too, given the budget constraints in Colorado. I think the initial fiscal note suggested that providing these tax breaks to companies would require foregoing some tax breaks to low-income families in Colorado. And I think that would be a bitter pill for a lot of legislators and families to swallow. So I'll leave it there and welcome other perspectives.
Great. Thank you, Stacy. Jack, I'm curious to hear from you if you or Xcel have thoughts or feedback on these competing legislative proposals. And I'm also especially curious about your reaction to the renewable energy requirements in Senate Bill 102 and whether you think that's doable and how you've reacted to both of these legislative concepts.
Yeah, thank you. We've engaged on both, and we're following both. And Rebecca's right that these similar concepts were afoot in the last session and did not pass. I think there's work to do on both. I would say we have a little bit more concerns with some of the clean energy policies in 102, just from sheer practicality. The concept of meeting every single hour with renewable energy is a really challenging one. In fact, I don't know that it's really been done at scale anywhere yet. And so we view that as something we're not sure that is actually feasible. And so I'll probably leave that there. I think it'd be interesting to look at currently, as I understand it, labor is more concerned with 102, more supportive of 1030, and they have a very strong jobs focus. So that kind of tells you how they're navigating and what they see as the outcomes of 102. On the 1030 side, I guess I'd probably differ with Rebecca a little bit. I don't think these are polar opposite bills. I could certainly imagine a very, very business-friendly bill that just cuts the sales taxes, doesn't apply any standards, and I don't think that's 1030 at all. I think it provides a sales tax exemption or incentive in exchange for certain things such as the water, very rigorous water requirements, closed-loop cooling requirements. I think that's actually very interesting that the data center supported that, and Marshall's comments earlier suggested to me that's kind of where the industry is evolving to, and some of the newer pieces, the newer data centers can get to a much, much better water usage profile, which I think is laudable. There's also a provision in 1030 that allows us to do something very similar to what the PUC approved, which is to, this gets very wonky and very nerdy, and I apologize, but we have a resource planning process that's about a 4-year cycle. And it takes about 4 years to get all the way through that, get all the final approvals, and it's just proved to be like twice as slow as what the data centers feel that they need to come online. So 1030 has a targeted resource acquisition pathway, and it does have clean energy requirements in it. It requires 3-to-1 clean energy versus non-clean energy or emitting energy, which is sort of like what our resource plans look like right now, and those are the ones that got us to 46% clean energy, 80% emissions reductions. We are rapidly aggressively trying to expand our set of technologies, but the reality is we do have some need for firm capacity, which is best provided through natural gas or thermal resources. I can talk a lot about what we'd like to do to expand that technology set, but we view 1030 as a little bit more flexible. I'd say we're less vested in the differences here than the data centers themselves are, and we're going to engage on both and see if we can get a good sort of Colorado compromise going here, because there may be a solution in sight. The industry it's nascent partially because it's paused in Colorado. They're trying to see what we're going to do. We are a question mark state in terms of data center development.
Thanks for that. Interesting. Marshall, I'm curious if there's anything in either one of these bills that you think will sync well or maybe stand in the way of the policies that the city of Aurora has put into place or is planning to put into place, and also if the city has a position on these pending bills.
Yeah, Chris, and this was mentioned earlier, both these bills have been out there for a little while. They're not brand new just this year, especially 1030. Aurora invested a lot of time in Aurora Water specifically last year when it was initially introduced. The things that Jack just talked about with the water requirements were missing entirely from the initial draft of the bill, and that was extremely concerning to Aurora Water and some other water providers. The evolution was kind of interesting. We pushed back very hard, had a lot of conversations on the fact that the initial bill had pages and pages of discussion on power, but water was not even really an afterthought in the initial proposed legislation. So the approach we took was to say, hey, you really need to talk to the water providers. You can't just assume that the water is going to be there and will not be an issue. The reaction, the edits, what ended up in 1030 wasn't exactly what we suggested, but it does show the evolution in the industry where they're shifting to more advanced cooling technologies that will conserve significantly more water. So we were happy with the changes that were made in 1030. From a water perspective, right now, Aurora Water is monitoring both bills. We think they both work from a water perspective. There are other differences in the bills. Again, the incentives are state-based. Local entities have been providing some incentives on a local basis, but not on a statewide basis. So we chose to kind of stay out of that discussion. We just focused on water, and again, both bills accomplished some good things actually from a water perspective.
Great, thanks. Rebecca, do you have anything else you want to add about those pending bills?
No, I think it'll be interesting.
Okay, great. Marshall, I'm curious, is the city of Aurora providing local incentives for data centers? And I guess I'm just curious to hear more about the city's perspective on data centers more broadly, not just the water question, but how is the city thinking about data centers in context of the city's economic development strategy and those kind of broader issues?
Yeah, that's a harder question. I am not necessarily the economic incentive person. So the water utility has a lot of conversations with our economic development folks. Aurora has provided some incentives for some of the data centers that have come in. The 8 data centers that we've got have come in, I think the oldest is maybe 25 years old now, so it's been there for quite a while. And again, that's the very inefficient water data center. The newer ones, some of those received some incentives. I don't know what the incentives were. Again, I was not in that conversation. We focused on the water requirements and said the incentives need to be very careful not to cross over and inadvertently kind of cancel out the benefit of our water requirements. And so, again, the recent ones that have come in have embraced the criteria. It was interesting, the first data center that came in under our large water user guide built a hybrid cooling system, we think. A lot of the data centers don't like to tell you exactly what they've done, but from what we can tell, they built a hybrid cooling system and they pushed things right up to the limit that we drew for them and are using about that volume of water. But the latest data center went all the way to the closed loop system, and they're consuming no water. And the conversations we've had with economic development and the data center people has confirmed what Jack mentioned, that the technologies are evolving, and regardless even of restrictions like Aurora has put in place, they think that the industry is going to be a lot more water efficient in the future as they go to more direct chip liquid cooled technologies that are more efficient for them. So it's interesting, but yes, we did incentivize some data centers.
Interesting. Stacy, maybe just to circle back with you to see if you have anything you want to add about the legislative proposals before we move on. I have a couple of other questions, but I just wanted to wrap up this part of the conversation first.
I'm not sure that I have much to add. I think I would agree with the other speakers that, because Colorado doesn't have a ton of data centers, we have this opportunity to kind of get it right. And so there's this kind of window here where I think we can shape data center development in Colorado. So again, I think we'd like to see these data centers help advance our clean energy and our climate goals, protect customers. So I do think that there's an opportunity. I think the legislators see that too.
Great. So I have just pivoting to another concrete policy conversation. The president this week, I think, announced a ratepayer protection pledge, which had been entered into with some of the larger data center developers. And so it's interesting because we've also now heard conversations about Xcel working with PUC about a large customer tariff, which of course doesn't directly involve the data center developers. And so I'm curious to hear from our panelists, what your reaction is to the president's announcement, how meaningful you think that agreement is, and what we need to do to implement that kind of agreement to build in some transparency and accountability and verification. And so maybe I'll pass that off to Rebecca first.
Oh, boy. Okay. I think, what the president said and committed to is exactly what we want to try to achieve in Colorado. And that's what I think will be debated with the large load tariff. We really need to protect residential customers. And right now, where we're sitting in Colorado, rates are about, Jack, 8 to 10% below the national average, I think, in Colorado. So energy, sort of writ large, is very affordable in this state right now, and we really want to hold on to that. I'd say so that is one of the primary tenets at the PUC as we sort of debate this is energy affordability. And the other piece is progress towards our clean energy goals and not moving backwards. So the interesting thing about the PUCs is that's where this all really happens. We are the regulator in this space, and that's where it'll get figured out. But certainly, sort of the dialogue around how important it is to protect ratepayers, I think, is helpful.
Thanks. Jack, do you have any reactions to that or thoughts on the ratepayer protection pledge?
Yeah, it's a great question, and really it reflects like how dynamic this environment is. Major development even this week. I think that it was interesting to me because we've heard a lot of interest in having the incremental costs. It's a kind of a wonky discussion, really, but basically assigning the full cost the data centers drive on the system onto the data centers, and we have no dispute with that, and we didn't have any dispute with that before either. It was interesting to me. I heard that more maybe on the left side, or maybe this is just the states I operate in. And so to see that come in from another part of the political spectrum, I honestly think that debate's pretty much over. We will certainly have tactical debates about exactly how we propose this structure, which is it's the art of assigning the costs, and we've done this for 100 years. New customers enter the system, and you add cost to the system, and then you have to decide how those costs are allocated. And you decide amongst residential customers, small commercial, large commercial, industrial, and now we have sort of this super class of very large industrial-ish loads. So it's a old exercise. It's a new version of this. The new version will reflect a more incremental cost basis. Historically, it's been done more on an average basis to kind of average the rates as new investments come in. So it's an interesting crossroads where we have the largest loads we've seen coming in at a time when the infrastructure is also much higher cost than we've seen. We've seen 50%, 100% cost increases, much to my chagrin and Rebecca's, because we've had to come in and say the cost went up. I'm very sorry, but this is the true cost of adding to the system now, and that is a fact, and that's what the market's doing. So we're doing that at that time, but we are seeking to charge the customers at that rate, call it the current cost rate, for this new class of customers, which would be a little bit different than historical. So I do think the debate is largely aligned, honestly, except for the specifics. Now we'll see when we bring that in, and we're seeing the same thing across 5 states. We're deeply interested in customer protection on this. Our rates are below the national average. Our bills are far below the national average. We're about 37% below the national average on an average electricity bill in Colorado in our system. It's partially climate, and it's partially our policies on efficiency and other things. So we have a good track record. We really do want to support it. If people perceive that the data centers are directly driving their bill up, I think it's going to be a much more challenging and volatile environment to do any of this. And I hope we get to some point where we can talk about kind of the value of data center development too, because we have some things to say. So.
Yeah. Great. Stacy, do you have any feedback on either the president's announcement, the idea, but also kind of the nuts and bolts of how we might actually see this happen and roll these policies out, and maybe what the role of the actual data center developers is in this conversation at this point?
Yeah, I think I generally would agree with what the other panelists have shared. Like, this affordability issue is key. It's key just from a fundamental standpoint of families being able to afford their energy bills and small businesses, but also, from a climate perspective, electricity has to be affordable to be competitive to electrify transportation and our buildings and industry as well. So, I think it cuts across many categories of sort of importance. I think, what we see is the policies that are enacted at the Public Utilities Commission or at the state legislature are, they're regulations. They're real and they're much more meaningful, I think, than a pledge that gets signed at the national level. So I think that is where we see sort of the rubber hitting the road. And, on that, I would say, I think, it's easy to agree to certain concepts, like a data center has to sign a contract for its energy for a certain amount of time. And I think that the real challenge is in figuring out what those details are. Like, is it a 10-year contract or a 15-year contract or a 20-year contract? Because those have really different sort of cost implications. And what portion of the data center's demand are they responsible for paying for? So I think that those are the types of details that are being wrestled with at public utility commissions kind of all over the country, red states and blue states and everywhere in between, and that Colorado will be wrestling with this spring.
Yeah. Thanks. I think there's a lot of interest in better data overall on the impact of data centers and resource use. And so, Marshall, you referred to this earlier where, the city of Aurora has some pretty interesting data on water use. And it also sounds like you're still working to figure out how to get even better data from your customers. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what kind of data is available that might be able to help inform some of these conversations, and any reflections you can share on your efforts to collect that data over time or to improve the exchange of data with your customers.
Yeah. So the data we have readily available to us is their water use data. So the meters now, and Aurora has AMI or advanced meter infrastructure where we can collect data on 15-minute increments. So we can tell how much people are using in a lot of refinement. What we can't necessarily tell always is what they're using it for. So we have a lot of historical information on what irrigation demands look like or things like that, but we don't necessarily, if we send water through a meter, we can't tell necessarily if it's a shared meter, how much is going to irrigation versus evaporative cooling if it's on at the same time. So we would have to get that data from the end user. The other thing that's been a little challenging for us, and a question that hasn't come up yet, maybe it was going to come up later, is if you create a lot of, and we hear this all the time, everywhere I go and talk about this, I get this question. We create this huge savings on water, but what's the impact on the power load associated with switching from evaporative cooling to refrigerant or closed system cooling? So we don't have necessarily the data on the power usage. We have industry-wide numbers that are published, and so we know they're saving 100% of their water, and we know how much that water is, the volume that they're saving. But for the energy increase in consumption, we have very unrefined data. So we have numbers out there that say, it's probably between a 5 to 20% increased energy demand associated with the cooling, but the cooling is only a 30% portion of the electrical demand for the facility. So we can kind of roughly say you're saving huge volumes of water, 90 to 100% of the water use at the facility for an almost negligible bump up or increase in energy, but we don't have the actual numbers or the data to say here's the exact energy increase compared to the exact water consumption. So I can tell you the water savings, but I can't tell you the exact energy increase, but it is small. And we visited with some of our data centers and said, hey, will you share that data with us? And they're like, well, no. But we'll confirm, if you push us enough, we'll confirm that it is a negligible impact for the increase in power demand. And we've said, well, can you define negligible? No. So it's been a little bit limited, but they have confirmed that it is negligible. The next discussion we got into with them was, well, if it's negligible, why isn't everybody just installing closed-loop refrigerant-based systems? And the answer to that was a little bit concerning. It's that water is too cheap. We don't price water. So because we don't charge enough for water, the power, even though it's negligible, the increase in power demand is a little bit more of a financial impact to them than the savings of water, even though the volume of water they save is huge. So that's a little bit concerning.
That the gears are turning hearing that. Jack, I think you had something you wanted to share.
Yeah, it was, Marshall and I were talking just before the panel, and it's sort of ironic, but also like maybe an opportunity or a gap, because he's told me what he just told the panel and the audience, and I really have the same experience. I don't know what they're using for water necessarily, and I don't get an A/B. Here's my data center with the less efficient cooling system, and here's my usage with the more efficient cooling system, and therefore there's whatever 30 megawatts more for the more efficient cooling system. I don't know, and agree 100% that the amount of sensitivity around the intellectual property is super high with this type of customer. I was actually surprised you said the megawatts of a data center, because I usually cannot, and I'm under pretty restrictive non-disclosure agreements about a lot of things. So I do think there's an opportunity for us to learn more about this. It doesn't feel like these facts are known as well as they could be, and maybe someday soon we'll find the right partner who can be that intermediary who can display a little bit more openness to doing that, to help that industry kind of fill us all in here. It would be nice in a few ways.
Yeah, Stacy, I know that WRA has also, talked a lot about the need for better data transparency from industry and this inverse relationship between water use and energy use. And so I wonder if you can share with us whether you think we're making any progress on that front. Have you seen any forward momentum, or, do you kind of share some of the concerns that Marshall just expressed about, pricing of water resources and how that might relate to this overall picture?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this data and transparency is a real issue. And as I mentioned earlier, Senate Bill 102 would sort of address that, but just for Colorado, not at a national level. There was an interesting study out of Central Arizona that compared two data centers, one that was wet evaporative cooled and one that used dry cooling, not the liquid immersion cooling, but dry cooling. And that provides some insight into these trade-offs in energy and water use. So the evaporative cool, or the wet cooled facility, kind of had flat energy demand around the year. And this dry cooled facility had a much higher spike in energy demand in the summer, which aligns with the summer peak for the rest of the electricity system. And so I guess from a policy perspective, we sort of don't see value in setting an explicit, you have to use dry cooling, because there are these trade-offs. We really think it's a decision that is sort of on a case-by-case basis, depending on, what the available renewable energy resources are and what the available water resources are, and those tensions. And so I guess that just gets to it's not an easy answer, and having better data from the data center customers themselves would help us better inform what the right answer is going forward.
Great, thanks. And Rebecca, does the PUC think through this question at all about the trade-offs between water use and energy use, or are you really just narrowly focused on, regulation of Xcel, and it doesn't really factor into the work much?
Yeah, good question. I mean, we are not a water regulator, so we're certainly aware of the broader environmental implications, but we really are just have the purview over how much energy they're going to use. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank goodness.
So I'm going to open it up to questions. We still have about 10 or 15 minutes, and I promise to leave some time. And so I know that a lot of folks have questions. So let me just check in first and see if we have any students in the room who want to jump in with a question. Any student questions? Okay, great. Here we go. Right here.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Just kind of walk through a little bit of thoughts from the whole thing we've all been through today, and then give you the context of the question here. So earlier we were told that this is kind of like a land grab. This is a potential, we're going to build out too much infrastructure, and that the people might be responsible for that. And then I'm being told right now that water may not be a major issue as we think, and that energy, we're capable of bringing them in. So the real issue or reason data centers hasn't been in Colorado is because of our regulations. My question is, why do we need to even bring them in if the rest of the country is making this gamble? Why does Colorado need to jump into that?
Good question. Anybody want to weigh in on that? Jack?
I can give maybe a couple of examples why we're intrigued by it. And I had testimony on this too in the JTS proceeding where we can do more than protect the customer. I think we can benefit the customer if they come in. And the reason for that is you should be able to spread more megawatt hour sales, more revenues across a fixed amount of infrastructure. It's like we're going to build an X amount of fixed infrastructure. If I can provide more energy sales across some elements of that, they will add to the fixed infrastructure without a doubt. But if we can spread some of the sales across some of the fixed infrastructure we'd already be implementing or have already built, there's an opportunity to actually provide customer benefit, number one. And then number two, I'll just give an example. About 10 days ago, we made an announcement. We have worked with Google in Minnesota to do a really cutting edge contract, in our view, where they're driving significant clean energy, 1,400 megawatts of wind, 200 megawatts of solar. But to me, what was really interesting is 300 megawatts of what's called long duration energy storage. Now, for those not steeped in utility nerdiness, that's a battery that lasts longer than 4 hours. In fact, this one would last 100 hours in terms of duration. And they were willing to make an investment on that technology. It was a 300 megawatt battery. We've done some commercialization on 2 of those batteries that are each at 10 megawatt scale. So we made some first steps, or taking some first steps on that in collaboration with the PUC. There was an approval that we got about 3 years ago on that. But Google was willing to step in and completely underwrite that next step of increasing the scale by 30-fold. And that was very, very impactful to me, where you've got this sector, and it's kind of one of the reasons I took this job, frankly. It's super well-financed, it's super innovative, and they can use their risk appetite in a way that I can't do. I get the same return on equity if I'm investing in a wooden pole or the most advanced generating plant in the world. In other words, it's completely indifferent to risk. Now they can move in and start to do these commercialization exercise, or not exercises, genuine investments to drive some of the technologies forward that I will struggle to get approval from the PUC for good reason, because they're riskier and it's a little harder to balance those risks with our investments and with the general customer base. It's harder to figure out where to allocate those risks. I can bring in a partner that has risk appetite and finances. We have a different opportunity to advance technologies from long duration energy storage to geothermal, which is precisely nowhere in Colorado on power generation, to lots of other things. So that's why I'm excited about it and excited in drawing them in here and excited to partner with them at Xcel Energy, because we want to do those types of deals to keep the clean energy progress going that we have started.
Rebecca, you're over here nodding. Are you in 100% agreement with Xcel on this?
I'm a little scared when the regulator is agreeing with the regulated.
Our mission is the same,
moment.
Rebecca. Jeez.
But I do agree with Jack. I mean, those are 2 key benefits. Can we use data centers to put downward pressure on rates? That would be phenomenal to achieve. And can they bring in some, jumpstart some of these technologies? We would love to see at scale geothermal in Colorado. And having an industry that's willing to take that risk and has the money to bring, I think is exciting. The third, I think, possible benefit I'll throw out there is, these are very large sources of energy use, as we've all talked about today. But if they are willing to interrupt their service when we have an energy emergency, I think there's potential there as well. Texas is already, I think, requiring this for their data centers. But if they're able to kind of go offline and go to backup power, and we got to figure out the generators. But when we have a crisis, we have a wildfire, we have a huge snow event, and you've freed up all of that energy use you've built for the data center, I think that might be interesting, especially in a changing climate world. So
I'm glad you mentioned that as somebody who has struggled with long outages due to having Xcel having to depower the grid in recent memories. I think that's a really good and important point for us to keep in mind, which is, safety and reliability in the face of all of this additional load. Stacy, do you have any thoughts on the benefits of data centers?
I'll just briefly, I have a couple thoughts. I think we probably differ on whether we see a lot of opportunity for downward pressure on rates, but I think that's to be determined. But I think we share the sentiment of this could bring new emerging clean technologies, and I guess I would say I think they're coming based on at least Xcel's load forecast in the JTS. So I do think we need to prepare for them. And then finally, I'll just note that from a climate perspective, just seeing them located in other states that have looser regulations doesn't benefit us. There's the Stargate project that is being developed in southern New Mexico that will have 3 to 4 gigawatts of behind the meter simple cycle gas turbines. From a climate perspective, that doesn't benefit any of us. We'd be better off having the regulations in place to enable those data centers in a state that has real clean energy goals.
Thanks. Marshall, do you see benefits from the perspective of water rates, the municipal water system in the city of Aurora? Do you think about this the same way?
From a water perspective, and the question was interesting, there are local revenue benefits to municipalities. So you have a steady stream of revenue. Municipalities are dependent. So the general fund budgets are dependent upon those regular streams of revenue, and data centers can provide some benefit from that perspective, adding revenue to the local communities that they end up in, which is one of the reasons why some local communities will choose to incentivize those. I'll go on a little bit of a tangent. From a water infrastructure perspective, and you mentioned building out infrastructure that could then be interesting. Another reason to be very intentional with the water demand associated with data centers is if you build a large demand on a water distribution system and then that demand goes away, you immediately inherit a water quality problem in the distribution system. So if the data center industry is truly evolving into more efficient cooling technologies and the volumes of water they need reduce after the infrastructure exists, the water providers end up with a water quality challenge in the distribution system associated with disinfection byproducts. So that was another thing for Aurora. We said we don't want temporary large water users anywhere in our system. We don't want to inherit new water quality demands. You have what are called data center rows in various states. Virginia was mentioned earlier. When I met with the folks from Virginia, I was cringing thinking about the evolution of technology. They have huge volumes of demand on their distribution system associated with data centers specifically. And then they have tangential demands on that same system. If that data center demand goes away, I don't even know what they're going to do. They're going to have a problem. So there are good reasons to be very intentional with policies. It's a good thing that Colorado is not quite as far along in this space, and that we're thinking about how to be intentional and to put protections in place from a water perspective and from an energy perspective.
Great, thank you. Additional questions? Dale, I think you have a question.
Oh, thank you. Very interesting panel, very interesting day. I don't want to sound alarmist, but one of the things we have to think about is the resilience of this entire infrastructure. And I am very worried about non-state actors, for example, launching deliberate attacks on the infrastructure. And have been around the policy, I always worry there may be a crack here between the different people who are interested in water, interested in so forth. What we may not think about enough is attacks, deliberate attacks coming from state actors, for example. And I'm just curious that, like I say, I have no desire to create any alarmist, but could you give me a little reassurance that somebody is thinking about, we've all painted this wonderful picture of what could happen with all this, the AI and so forth, but is anybody thinking about that in a deliberate fashion?
Anybody want to answer that question?
Looks like everyone's looking at me.
I'm happy. Okay.
I think it's a little different focus. I think a lot of the focus here is about how to develop data centers in Colorado, how to sort of do that the right way in Colorado. You're raising an issue that is AI driven, and we are absolutely very focused on our cybersecurity aspects as well as physical security aspects. I think AI will exist, and I think it will enable some good things, but potentially some bad things as well. I mean, we have all, I guess, I can't give you detailed stories about this, but we have a chief security officer. They come out of these sectors. Our staff who does that, it's a big staff. Some of them are in our building, monitoring this all the time around our physical and cyber security infrastructure exposures, if you will. So. I am as well. I mean, we get deliberate malicious attacks multiples every day on our IT systems. So it's long been part of our our operations to understand that, recognize that. We're certainly aware that there have been attacks that have taken down power grids in other countries, and sometimes small parts. There have been attacks here as well. So it's a big ongoing challenge. And that challenge will persist. If we develop 0 additional data centers in Colorado, that challenge will be, I'd say, really the same challenge. So I don't know if I helped you, and I'm not exactly the right person to help you, but it's a very legitimate concern that you have.
Marshall, did you want to add something as well?
Yeah, I can add that, yes, we spend a lot of time looking at the risks for our systems. Large water utilities and electric utilities have significant efforts that we put into ensuring that we have redundancy, resiliency, and protections in place for our infrastructure. We partner with some interesting organizations at different times to come in and do evaluations for intentional attacks on our cyber and physical assets. Some of those agencies tell us we're not supposed to tell anybody who they even are, but we partner with them and do various different risk analyses and drills and all kinds of things. There are a lot of potential real threats out there, and we're very intentional with how we try to prepare for those.
Thanks, Marshall. We have time, I think, for one more question. I think right over here. Yeah.
This is kind of going sideways a bit but with all the discussion about the outgrowth of the eco-friendly environments with wind and solar, the impact on our land and on our animals in Colorado is massive in terms of the potential death of the animals, the death of the birds, et cetera. What is the PUC as well as Xcel doing, or anybody here on the panel doing to mitigate the impact in our state?
Want me to take that one first? Yeah, so super good question. And you're absolutely right. There's just a lot of development going around, especially in the Eastern Plains, that hasn't seen this type of infrastructure coming in. Where the PUC's role is not to determine where, let's say, a solar field is located. It's more the costs and the benefits of what that's providing to customers. So we don't get involved in siting. I will tell you this is a very active discussion in Colorado with Department of Natural Resources and Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And Xcel certainly, when they go out and build, have to get the right permits and do the studies that are required both state or locally. So maybe, Jack, you can expand on that a bit.
Yeah, it's a great question. As we sought to reduce carbon emissions, those are more local or more sort of centralized generating units in a lot of ways. Now that we've moved to wind and solar, it's absolutely taking up more acreage of land to do some of that. So it's one of those trade-offs, and it's going to become a bigger issue. You flag that, and frankly, I think the AI demand it's going to increase that to some extent. And our last JTS, our resource plan, which was called the Just Transition Solicitation, we had portfolios that range from 5,000 megawatts to 14,000 megawatts. It was a scale that we'd never seen, and it was a combination of things, including the demand growth. And that's just a different scale than we've had before. As far as mitigation or managing that, we are, there's a lot to it in terms of just species management. So for a wind farm, for instance, there's a lot of site monitoring for avian impacts. There is a lot of assessment on critical habitat for things like the lesser prairie chicken, where we've participated in area swaps and things like that to manage that. And I know that they're using monitoring systems. There's some sort of live curtailments of the wind farms when sensitive species are known to be flying nearby and those sorts of things. So it's evolved a lot. There's not really a zero impact energy source. And so we're seeking to minimize that. But I agree with you that land use is going to become a larger concern as we move to kind of more land using renewable energy technologies.
With the minimal amount of solar, what you're talking about, you're talking, 3,000 or more panels, 5,000 panels. And so is there any rethinking of the PUC or in Colorado to look at going back to natural gas, which doesn't have that impact on the animals? Because I feel like we're almost like taking ourselves and putting ourselves in front of the land and the earth and some of the other things that we're doing because of how we view the climate change.
We haven't gone away from natural gas particularly, so I don't know if we're going back to it. But I hear the question. We're doing the things that I mentioned that we're doing. Where this goes long term, you are definitely seeing across the industry a lot more interest in seeing whether we want to do more nuclear. That is a more geographical, central. It produces an awful lot of power for a certain amount of land area, and it doesn't emit carbon. We have no tangible, serious proposals in Colorado for that. We do operate 2 nuclear plants in Minnesota, so it's something that we evaluate. But at this time, our best technologies are wind, solar, batteries, and natural gas. And that's why I'm so passionate about expanding the option set. I think geothermal could be pretty interesting, and it won't have that, that large land area usage. So we're really interested in that. So there's, again, no impacts. There's no technology that doesn't have impacts, and we're going to have to figure out how to balance that. And it's probably a bigger challenge now. I'd love to hear from Stacy on this, because I bet you have some land use thoughts.
Yeah, and I'll say, to be honest, I'm less deeply involved in our lands program's work to try and guide the siting of renewables. We do see it as really critical to protecting critical habitat, waterways, et cetera. I think when we look at getting to 100% zero carbon energy by 2040 or 2050 across the region, the build out, if you're relying just on wind and solar and batteries, the build out is staggering and becomes even more challenging, I think, with these data center loads. And so I think that informs Western Resource Advocates thinking on this. We're very excited to hopefully see geothermal start to expand, but it's caused us to also wrestle with this issue around nuclear. And we don't have a firm position yet, but I think that we remain open to it.
Rebecca, do you have any closing thoughts on that question?
No.
Okay.
Well covered. Yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists.